I never believed in aliens, until the night I walked into the wrong room. I built my life on screws and circuits. For 35 years I kept things that hummed from falling apart. I could tell you the sound a failing relay makes before it goes silent. I knew how to read a wiring diagram the way other men read a newspaper. Practical things kept the world tidy. Grief didn't. Grief turned my world into a loose mess of parts I didn't know how to assemble again. Sarah died 6 months before the panel. We'd been married 29 years. She'd been the steady counterweight to my tools. When she left, cancer took her on a Tuesday morning, quiet as a cupboard closing. Every routine in the house turned its face toward absence. The kettle, the coat on the peg, the mug she always used for chamomile tea. They all sat like accusation. My hands kept busy at work because otherwise my mind would press too close to the emptiness that would not be fixed with oil or tightening. At the facility, the machines demanded attention. At night, the rest of the world slept. It was what I was good at, and it was what I had left. I worked nights at a government-contracted facility on the far edge of a logistics park. Nondescript buildings, a chain-link fence, sodium lamps turning the asphalt the color of old bones. My badge opened doors. My flashlight found the little faults others missed. People called me Tom, sometimes Brass because my father had been a machinist and I had his steady hands. I liked that. Labels are tidy. The building we maintained held equipment with names that meant nothing outside of briefings and NDAs. Panels were listed on the schematics with a single designation, D series. Most of the units were locked in vaults or behind racks of air handlers. Everything smelled the same, ozone and coolant and the low, constant noise of air moving through vents. On nights when the work was light, I walked the corridors patrolling like a librarian, moving between stacks, checking seals, logging temperatures, tightening a loose screw or two. That night it was raining. I remember because my boots kept leaving wet crescents on the concrete. My shift dragged slower than usual, the kind of slow that leaves room for your head to find the corners you avoid. I had the day-off excuse stacked in my chest. Just tonight, Tom. But the building needed a walkthrough, and my supervisor trusted me to be thorough. I told myself I was methodical. I told myself that moving kept me from sitting at home next to the empty chair in the kitchen. The corridor was longer than it looked on the map. Fluorescents hummed in rhythm. Doors zoned with clinical labels, A1, B3, C4, black letters on white plates. I kept my flashlight close and my keycard ready. My eyes had become a little mechanical, tracing edges, noting dust patterns, checking for anything that looked out of place. I turned down a hallway I had walked 100 times before and found a door marked D2. It should have been D1. There was a stairwell 2 doors down. The map in my pocket, my brain, more precisely, told me D2 sat behind 2 locked panels and a motion sensor. I swore under my breath when I fumbled with the keycard to find the latch wasn't cooperating. It stuck, and because my hands were hands that fixed things, I pushed harder, and the catch gave with a small, wrong sound. The door swung open onto a dark room. The room smelled clean and cold, like polished glass. The air tasted faintly metallic. Minimal lighting was arranged in strips along the floor, a blue low glow that didn't illuminate so much as outline the space. In the center of the room, sitting like some artifact left in a museum, was a panel. If you're imagining metal and dials, and so was I for the first 2 seconds, then you're thinking of the wrong construction. This device was a black, convex disc, the kind of black that absorbs light instead of reflecting it. It looked like a perfect drop of night frozen on a pedestal. The surface was not just glass. It was something physically cool against the air, and when I brought my hand closer, the faint light along the floor seemed to flare and then recede, as if the room itself exhaled. I remember touching it the way I remember nothing else after that. Slow, because that's how you touch something fragile, and because there was no protocol in any manual for unexpected black disc in the wrong room. My fingertips brushed the surface, not hard, not with some ceremonial intent, just an ordinary touch by a man who fixes things. The panel pulsed. It was a single, small pulse of light that ran like heat under my skin. It wasn't a mechanical blink of status LEDs. It felt like an acknowledgement, like the panel recognized me and offered back a beat. A soundless thump in my chest answered, my pulse out of rhythm for the first time that night. Then I heard the words, not in my ears, but in the narrow place behind my forehead where thought lives. The sentence was simple, and it landed like a stone in a quiet pond. Why are you empty? There was no voice. There was only the question. It felt like a question that belonged to a stranger and a lover at the same time. It held no judgment. It was only a line of curiosity aimed at the deepest place in me, where my wife's absence had hollowed a seam. I jerked my hand back as if burned. The panel dimmed. For a moment I stood frozen, my breath loud in my own ears, peering into the polished black where no reflected face looked back at me. The rational part of my brain went into action, a list running like a maintenance log. Atmospheric discharge, auditory misattribution, optic illusion. My hands, being hands, tested the edges. Nothing stuck. The panel's housing was flush with the pedestal. No seams, nothing to pry. I walked out of the room with the panel's pulse still hot under my skin. The door closed softly behind me, sealing the cold memory in the space I had no right to be in. For the next hour I walked the building slower, checking temperatures, confirming HVAC cycles. I told myself it had been my imagination, a grief-induced audio hallucination, something I would file away and forget. I did not forget. That morning, after I'd gone home and tried to sleep in a house that didn't include Sarah anymore, I found myself making a small entry in the notebook I kept for odd observations. I don't know why I kept a notebook, except that the work had trained me to log anomalies. There was a habit to it. Item, timestamp, note. The page read, A03-1702, 14, D2 door open, panel in room, convex black disc, touch, pulse, subjective, heard phrase, why are you empty? No other personnel present. I underlined subjective. That was important. I didn't want anyone to think I was making fact claims. I was a technician. My work lived in measurable realities. This was not measurable. It could be a misfiring auditory cortex, an ebbing of sleep. It could be too many nights crammed in. It could be nothing. So I logged it as nothing, the way a mechanic logs a part that needs replacing. But the world is stubborn. The things we write down sometimes refuse to behave like nothing. Over the next 2 weeks I avoided D2. My shift patterns allowed it. I sent emails at odd hours marking the room as inaccessible. I told myself caution was the same as professionalism. Yet coincidences accumulated like dust on a neglected lens. I began to notice small shifts that would be mundane if taken alone. A coffee cup on the break table I was certain I had not made. The radio in the lobby switching between stations in a way that hinted at a dial being nudged. A security camera that saved a corrupted image file with a shadow where no shadow should be. These were the sort of things you could explain away by habit, by poor housekeeping, by a tired janitor with a temp job. But when I cross-referenced times, when I traced the tiny seams between events, a pattern wove itself out of coincidence. At 03:14 on the 17th, the same timestamp I had penciled into my notebook, the break room log recorded the microwave cycling without a user input. The security camera over the lobby captured the door to D2 closed at 02:20, and then, in the clip I'd later pull, a blip of a figure, blurred, only a silhouette, standing for 2 seconds in frame before the image corrupted and went black. My keycard log showed no entry at those times. My badge reported me clocked outside the building at 04:12. I have the printouts. I printed them because printing makes things feel more real. I brought these discrepancies to the night supervisor. He offered the tired shrug of someone trained in budgets and excuses. Cameras glitch, he said. Systems reset without logging. We've seen it. File a ticket. I filed tickets with tags and numbers. Tickets have a way of filing you back. I started keeping a private ledger, each oddity, time-stamped and cross-checked. I tethered things to my own state. What had I been feeling at the time? Was I tired? On edge? Grieving? I wrote down the things because someone had once taught me that the first step in understanding a fault is to gather the symptoms. The entries began to cluster. Moments of intense loneliness, when the house pressed its quiet into me like a weight, corresponded with oddities at work. A bracket that would not hold. a sensor resetting, a recorder that saved incomplete files. It was easy to dismiss it as selective memory. Grieving men notice oddities because their world is already off-kilter. Still, there was a climb to it. Coincidence here, coincidence there, then another. A pattern seems to be a pattern when it repeats in a way that exceeds expected randomness. At the third week, I went back into D2. I told myself I was going for verification. I told myself I would bring a handheld recorder, a camera, something to log what couldn't be logged on the building's systems. I also told myself I would not touch the panel, but I betrayed that caution like a man who knows better than his own wishes. The room smelled the same, antiseptic and cold. The panel sat in the blue light like a dark eye. This time I put my palm flat against the surface and waited. My breath came out in a small steam. The panel pulsed again. The image of Sarah flashed behind my eyes, and for a second, the rawness of the house hit me like a fist. When the words arrived this time, they were not the single question but a conversational ripple. Emptiness calls. It was not a threat. It was a statement. It felt less like a diagnosis and more like a fact, an observation of cause and effect. I did not know how to answer. Nothing I had learned at the job provided a response. I left a wire recorder running behind a vent and walked out. I didn't tell anyone. I had the quaint private thought that if I could capture the audio, I could prove to myself that what I had heard was external. The recorder's file later held nothing but static and a faint compression artifact no bigger than a sigh. There was no external voice. The artifact was not the question. At my age, the brain throws you gifts and tricks. It replays victories and losses, and when you are grieving it will play the same loss in loop until you learn its edges. Then Marcus showed up in my life like an overdue service call. Marcus wasn't on the staff list. He was lean, mid-40s, with a jaw that looked like it had been pressed by a night shift lint roller for a decade. He had been an electrician at a plant 2 facilities over until his badge access shifted one day, and shifted again until he no longer belonged in the rooms he used to maintain. He came to me not with a badge, but with a question in his mouth. "Tom Brenner?" he asked, like a man prefacing a long invoice. I knew his face from a passing security photo a colleague had shown me when they whispered about the D-series oddities. His eyes were quick and too bright for the hours he kept. He carried his own toolbox, the kind with small, sensible compartments. He told me he had been following irregularities across a handful of sites and had noticed a similar black convex surface in rooms that were supposed to be empty. They were always in a D-series space, with that same blue floor lighting and a pedestal that seemed to want to be noticed. He didn't offer an explanation at first. He offered a ledger. He showed up with printouts and scribbled notes and an old Polaroid that had the ghostly suggestion of a person where no person had been. 3 people, he said, in that low voice of someone who has counted bodies of inconvenient phenomena. 1 transferred out. 1 put on a medical leave and never quite came back. 1. He stopped and rubbed a thumb along the rim of the cup he had not had time to finish. 1 what? I asked. 1 died, he said. Not here, not violent. But the timeline after he touched the panel is weird. He started missing shifts, would call in late, forget names. You know the progression. They took him to a clinic under a contract, and then he was moved. Personnel files go blank after that. Marcus had stories, and a thin smile that wasn't really a smile. He told me about a cohort. People who had been tagged as interfaces or candidates because of their psychological profiles. People who had been brought into rooms for observation and then tracked. He spoke of Dr. Carla Mendez with a mixture of respect and caution. He told me she was smart, quiet, and precise. He told me the panels had been part of a program to study contact. He told me small things that made the hair come up on my forearms. There were logs kept by a subset of technicians on paper, outside the system. There were notes of mood states being cataloged like samples. "Why come to me?" I asked. "Because you touched it," Marcus said. "And because you left prints in the wrong places." His eyes were searching. "Because you didn't panic, and you didn't run off screaming. You didn't frame it as a religious experience or as a delusion. That makes you useful. Useful is a word I haven't heard directed at me in years, in a way that felt like anything but a measurement. I was useful because I was steady, not because anything of me had been changed. I wanted to be utility. I wanted to be solid. He warned me, because that's what mentors do, with the conviction of a man who has seen the cost. People aren't the same afterward, he said. Some of them can't handle the way the panel mirrors them. It takes what you feel and hands it back with a weight. The ones who try to control it get burned. The ones who ignore it get swallowed by a quiet. I asked him what he meant by mirror. He shrugged. Feeling is a signal. Thinking is noise, he said, quoting a phrase that had already been echoing in my head like an awkwardly placed chorus. Marcus's face hardened when he spoke of the observer. He used the word like a title. Whatever is on the other side isn't human, he said. But calling it alien makes people expect spacecraft and beams and dramatic movies. This isn't that. It's an attention. It seems to be testing modes of interaction, not invasion routes. But attention is dangerous too. He told me there had been attempts to measure the panel's effects. Small tests in towns, nothing headline-worthy. Just pilot studies where a group of people focusing on a single emotional aim were monitored for changes in local statistics. He showed me graphs that rose and fell. Small things changed. Shoplifting dipped. A hospital ER saw fewer panic attacks for a week. The changes were small and ephemeral, like breath on a mirror. The problem, Marcus said softly, wasn't that things changed. The problem was the impulse to accelerate them. People want a knob. They want a dial to fix the world. But you can't dial feeling. Feeling is not a code you can enter without consequence. He told me about someone named Jenkins, a man who had in private tried to force a contact for the purposes of making money. It had not gone well. Jenkins had become compulsive, setting up sessions, trying to schedule group states like you schedule a conference room. The more he tried to manufacture things, the worse his life got. His relationships frayed. He lost his temper. He slept less. He shouted once in a meeting, and people looked at him like he'd grown a second head. Power without wisdom destroys, Marcus said, and then stared at me like he wanted me to take the weight of the sentence into my bones. I listened, because that's what I do. I'm wired to listen. I have to anticipate what a machine is about to do, often to keep it from doing it. A human who has been changed by what they think of as power is a different equation. They become unpredictable, and unpredictability isn't something you can bolt a panel to and expect to manage. Marcus offered caution, but he also offered a doorway. Coordinates, a time, a warehouse where he said I could see for myself what he had been talking about. He didn't say the word observer until the last minute. When he said it, his voice went low and almost respectful. I won't promise you'll like what you find, he told me. I won't promise understanding. I will promise you this. If you want answers, you will get more questions. If you want to stay away, that's an equally respectable choice. Don't pretend it's cowardice. Restraint is underrated. There was an argument I rehearsed in my head, responsibility versus curiosity, the way my fingers used to weigh the torque of a bolt. I told myself I should stay away. I told myself panels were dangerous. I told myself it was probably some program that had a silly name and a budget and a cadre of earnest but exhausted scientists who would have me sign something about confidentiality and call it a day, but the house leaned at that moment like a lean-to made from the rain. The emptiness had been asking its own question since the panel first asked me why I was hollow. What if the thing that could draw me toward the edge was the thing that could also hold a meaning I couldn't manufacture in the garage of my life? What if my hands, the ones trained to repair the broken, could mend something else, if not the past, then the way I inhabited the present? Marcus left me with a page of coordinates and a name of a building I had passed 100 times on the interstate without thinking about. He drove off with the kind of finality that leaves a stain. I folded the paper into my wallet like a prayer or a receipt and told myself I would make a decision in the morning. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my back and watched an empty ceiling, counting the minutes since Sarah's last laugh. The house felt like a room that had been painted over a fire. The tools were where they had always been. The world was still functional in the way it had been functional since before she had sung lullabies into the angle of dusk. A life is a room you paint with actions. When someone leaves it, becomes a study in what you no longer do. At 3 in the morning I got in my car and drove. I told myself I was going to see, not touch, the black disc in the warehouse Marcus said he used to meet people. I would be purely observational, like a witness called to testify. I told myself that being there would be enough to take the itch out. I told myself that because it was easier than admitting I wanted to know what "why are you empty" meant. The warehouse was a heavy rectangle of brick and concrete off an industrial road. Lights hung like moons along the facade. It smelled like oil and wet concrete. Marcus was there, leaning against the hood of a truck, and when I pulled up, he slid into the passenger seat with a sigh that could have been relief or fatigue. He handed me a thermos that had coffee that tasted like paper and sugar and more sleep than I had had in 6 months. Inside the warehouse, the lighting was different. Warmer, practically orchestral in the way it softened edges. The air was still. The hum of the city seemed to stop just beyond the walls. There were other people, 3, maybe 4, spread out like scattered instruments waiting for a conductor. They watched me in a way that wasn't hostile, but was wary, like animals that come close to a strange sound to determine if it will eat them. Marcus introduced me in the way a barber introduces a man to a chair. "Tom Brenner," he said. "He works nights. He touched D2. That was all. No pity, no fanfare. Their faces were not Hollywood faces meant to sell stories. They were ordinary, each with their own small ruin. One woman smelled faintly of lavender. One man had a respirator scar on his cheek. They did not seem like the sort of people you would imagine in an experiment. That made whatever we were doing feel less academic and more human. They called themselves a cohort, though some of them winced at the phrase like it had a bureaucratic taste. I listened to their stories by listening, the way you tune a radio and wait for the station to settle. A woman named Anna said that after touching a panel, she had stopped hearing the refrigerator hum and instead heard a soft music she couldn't place. It comforted her for a week, and then became a thing that raked at the back of her head until she moved to another city. A man named Lewis said the panel showed him faces he had forgotten. His mother as a girl, a brother whose name he couldn't recall. And the sight made him cry in a way he had thought his hands had exhausted. "We're not all the same," Marcus said, and that was true. Their outcomes varied like circuit boards wired differently. Some adapted, some broke, some simply changed. That lack of uniformity was less comforting than the consistency of normal equipment failure. It meant interpretation. It meant choice. Dr. Carla Mendez arrived not long after. She was how I imagine scientists who grow tired of conference room euphemism look: clean, precise, and the sort of person who uses numbers as a way to keep fear legible. Her badge gave her the way into rooms that most of us only saw on maps. She did not smile often. When she did, it was a quick thing, like a switch. She explained the program with clinical calm, panels placed at intervals, their electromagnetic and spectral signatures cataloged, cohorts assembled and observed under supervision. The public files called it ambiguous stimulus research. The private files had terms that read colder. Dr. Mendez did not explain why a panel would ask a question like, "Why are you empty?" because she didn't have an explanation. She had hypotheses, graphs, and enough of a knowledge base not to make wild claims. We began by asking whether certain prolonged affective states in trained groups correlated with measurable social metrics, she said. We found small-scale shifts. She left that phrase in the air as if the data were an ornament of caution. Small-scale shifts. That is what pragmatic men like me prefer. Adjustments and deviations rather than miracles. Dr. Mendez used the word interface to describe the panels. They're not instruments in the traditional sense, she told us. They seem to respond to states rather than intentions. They're mirrors in a way we don't yet understand. She did not say alien, and that made the room thinner. If you do not name the thing, you allow it to be more than you can categorize. Someone in the back, one of the cohort, asked her the thing everyone wanted to ask. Can it help? Dr. Mendez's eyebrows moved in that quiet way like a scientist who is being asked to sign a blank check. It can correlate, she said. It can surface. It cannot be relied upon as a mechanism for guaranteed outcomes. When groups attempt to instrumentally manipulate states to force outcomes, the variance increases and the ethical costs rise. There are mental health issues. There are social disruptions. The panels amplify what's already present, not what you want to impose. That statement landed on a table at which emotions were small and private. Why are you empty? Emptiness calls. Feeling is a signal. Thinking is noise. The phrases threaded together into the beginning of some logic I could not hold in my hands like a wrench, but that did not mean it wasn't real. At the end of the night, as we dispersed into the early hours, Dr. Mendez pulled me aside like an engineer who needs a technician for a tricky job. She did not ask about the pulse. She asked about my routine. She asked, with more human curiosity than I expected, how I kept my life together after Sarah. I told her simple truths, the kettle, the empty chair, the way my hands moved to fix things, and the conversation changed from data to something like kindness. Why are you empty? The question had opened like an invitation or a wound. I did not have an answer. I had a ledger, a pulse in my palm, and a folder with a Polaroid that might have been a glitch and might have been a signal. I had Marcus's warning and Dr. Mendez's calibrated concern. I had a cohort of people whose lives had become uneven by the same blunt instrument. I drove home on a road that smelled of wet tar and distant rain. The city slept. My hands on the wheel remembered Sarah's grip on my sleeve, slight and warm, and for a moment it felt like a map with a torn corner. The night was not solved. It had opened doors I had been content not to open. The panel had asked me a question I could not answer except in the way men answer with work, by keeping going. I tucked the coordinate page back into my wallet and did not look at it. I told myself I had seen all I needed to see to make a choice. But the world has a way of asking questions more than once. The following day on my shift, the security log picked up a phantom entry at Oro 220. The camera in the lobby saved a corrupted frame with a shadow. My notebook's margins filled with scribbles. I wiped my hands on my pants and went into the small room where I kept my things, where my life was reduced to a jacket, a thermos, and a collection of small tools that, like my handwriting, were legible. I made a decision that felt like the hinge of something. I told myself I'd go back to the warehouse, not tonight, not at 3 in the morning, but soon enough. I would not go because of curiosity alone. I would go because that black surface asked me who I was, and I could not unhear the question. The first time you stand in front of an unanswerable question, you feel small, like the size of a nut in the palm of a giant's hand. The second time, you feel the compulsion to at least learn what the giant looks like. I had touched the panel twice, I had heard the question twice, and there was a rustle in the fabric of my days that wouldn't smooth out. When I left the small room, I pinned my badge on my chest and walked toward the doors like a man who knows that his hands will do what they've always done. Check, tighten, log. But there was also a tremor under my ribs, the kind that feels like both fear and something else. An ache that could be grief or possibility. I was a technician with a broken schematic, and a sense that fixing meant more than returning a display to its factory settings. On the walk to D2, I found, by accident, a security photo print slipped under a maintenance clipboard. It was the corrupted frame from the lobby camera. You can call it nothing. You can call it a glitch. But I have looked at many damaged things, and damaged things sometimes reveal their own strange truth. There in the grain was a blur that did not match any person I knew. It had long angles, eyes like dark beads. If you stretch belief long enough, you can see shapes made of nothing. But the image also had an impossible softness. I pocketed the print. It felt like a token you keep out of superstition. I walked toward D2 because the question had become a small, persistent engine in me. I also walked because I didn't know anything else to do. The building hummed, the corridors sat like a ship at rest, and I had a page of coordinates in my wallet and a voice in my head that had no speaker but spoke anyway. When I reached the door, my hand hovered over the handle like a man about to open a vault. Not because I intended to steal anything, but because opening it might mean a kind of confession. I pushed. Inside the room, the panel pulsed, as if it had been waiting. This time the light slid along my palm like something shy. The question arrived, not as an accusation but as an offer. Why are you empty? I did not have a tidy answer. Instead, I realized I had been accumulating little things, coincidences, logs, a cohort who in small ways had been altered, and that whatever this was, It did not live in the world of schematics. It lived in the messy places where feeling meets action and where actions build a life. I pressed my forehead to the cool surface. Not for contact so much as to hear if it echoed. It did. The echo came as a memory of Sarah bending over a sink, humming to herself, the tiny private music that used to keep my house from being a museum. Emptiness calls, I said out loud. Not to the panel but to myself. Because words sometimes anchor you like bolts. The panel did not answer in words. It simply pulsed once and then dimmed. The light in the room shifted, and when I stepped back, the air felt different, thinner, like a page turned. I walked out and locked the door behind me, which is the point at which a person's life splits into before and after, without fanfare. People who want neatness want a single moment with signage. Real life is more patient. It spreads itself out like a stain. The unbelievable moment didn't come as a flash of trumpets. It arrived as a pulse in a black disk, and a question that lodged in my chest. I started gathering evidence because it's what I do. I started listening to the cohort because that's what any technician who believes in maintenance does. He watches failure and learns its rhythms. I met Marcus, who offered ledger and map and warning. I sat in a warehouse under warmer light and listened to a scientist say that the panels were mirrors that made feeling legible in a way that could change small things in the world. I left with more questions than I had at the beginning, and a sense that the thing I'd always called skepticism needed a new definition. The night the panel asked me why I was empty, it did not give me an answer. But it opened a door in me that has been standing ajar ever since. If you've ever experienced something you couldn't explain, leave a one-line comment below, just a sentence about the moment. I won't promise to read each one, but there is a small comfort in knowing you're not the only one carrying a strange, private thing. I hadn't decided what I would do about the coordinates Marcus had given me. I had not decided whether to step across that thin line between witness and participant. And yet, as I drove home, I felt the low, dangerous tug of curiosity, less like hunger and more like gravity. The next evening, the security ledger lit up again with a phantom entry. The camera's corrupted frame saved another shadow, and somewhere in the margins of the files I keep is a note in my hand. 03290220. Lobby corruption. Panel reaction. Minor pulse. Subjective. Increased longing. When a pattern starts to hum, you can walk away, or you can follow its sound. I was not innocent of the choice. I felt it like a hot knot in my throat. Marcus had warned me. Dr. Mendez had cautioned us. The cohort had a history of frayed lives. Yet the question still sat there in my chest. The blunt thing, the hook the panel had thrown, and it made something in me restless. The warehouse coordinates were no longer a mystery. They were a patient door that would open when I chose to push it. I had a ledger of anomalies, a Polaroid that could be explained as a camera fault, and a head full of maybe. I had also learned that the panel did not speak in the way we expect speech. It communicated in pulses and questions, and by reflecting what was already present. So I drove back to the warehouse. The doors opened, and Marcus waited. He regarded me not with triumph but with the mild gravity of someone who knows the job has a cost. He slid a folded sheet of paper across the table that had a single stamped name on it, Observe, and pointed to the list of names below. Mine was second. The first belonged to someone named Jenkins, whose story was a caution that stung. My hands shook slightly as I folded the page and slipped it into my jacket. Not from fear, or maybe only a little, but from the sense that I had crossed another line. The world had shifted in ways that could not be lubricated by new parts. Marcus nodded, as if to an unspoken pact. Don't try to fix it, he said. Fixing is a machine's answer. This wants something else. I had no better answer than the one I'd kept since the first pulse. I didn't believe in aliens. I still didn't quite. I believed in a question that had teeth. I believed in a mirror that didn't flinch. I believed that the rest of the story would require me to be honest about why I was empty, and that to do that I would have to stop pretending I could keep everything at arm's length. We walked toward the back of the warehouse, the place where the floor sloped and the light softened. The other names on the roster shuffled behind us like shadows. Marcus's hand was steady at my shoulder, And for the first time since Sarah had left, I understood that sometimes hands are not for fixing things only, they are for holding. Marcus's grip on my shoulder was steady, but not heavy. We walked deeper into the warehouse and the air seemed to take on a weight, something like expectation, only colder. There were mats on the concrete, folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, and at the far end a curtain that had clearly been chosen for its opacity rather than any sense of ceremony. The names on the roster were pinned to a board, Observe, with columns of dates and initials. When I sat, the fold of my jacket rubbed against the scar on my palm where a grinder had once bit me. The pain was a small, honest thing in a room full of metaphors. We began with nothing dramatic. Dr. Mendez set parameters. We signed confidentiality forms that weren't law so much as ritual. There were checklists, sleep hours, medication disclaimers, a basic screening that was kinder than bureaucratic forms usually are. She asked us to report headaches and nightmares. She reminded us that participation was voluntary. She said the word control, with a face that made the word look like a dangerous machine. You may feel unusual things, she said. You may find memories surface. We will have clinicians available. We will not promise results. We will log everything we can. There was a table with instruments that looked reassuringly mundane. Pulse oximeters, a laptop with graphs, a clipboard with handwritten notes. The panels themselves were not present. This was preparation, a way of making uncertainty legible. Marcus sat 2 chairs down from me, his jaw working like a man who keeps a file on his emotions. Anna and Lewis were there. Jenkins' name was on a separate list marked exclusionary. To our cohort, Jenkins had become a whisper that meant a man who had tried to turn a phenomenon into a product and had been, in part, consumed by the attempt. We spent a week in practices that Dr. Mendez framed as state calibration. The word felt sterile, but the actions were simple. Breathing checks, noting when your mind wandered, saying aloud the names of things you saw. She insisted on phrasing it clinically, sustained effective attention, because science softens what otherwise looks like ritual. There was no recipe. There was no incantation. The small acts were there to help us notice what was already happening in our heads and in our bodies. On the 10th night, we were led one by one into a curtained space. It shouldn't have felt like admission to a secret, but it did. The curtain opened on a low pedestal, not the D-series disc, not yet, but a small facsimile, a black convex disc mounted on a stand, its surface inert under a ring of soft LED light. Someone called it a test panel, a control. It was a copy, a model. Dr. Mendez said we would practice presence in front of that surface before anyone was taken to a D-series site. They hooked sensors to my finger and wrist. A monitor showed my breath rate, heart rate variability, numbers that used to be gibberish to me, but now looked like a readout of a machine that could be calmed. Marcus gave me a sideways glance, the expression of a man who knows that curiosity has the same muscles as stubbornness. You don't have to touch it, he said. You can simply sit. I sat. My hands had been built for moving parts. Sitting in front of a disc was an odd job for them. I looked at the black surface the way you look at a photograph of someone you used to know. I thought of Sarah watering plants on a summer morning, the way the sun used to cut her hair into gold. I felt a hollow, familiar, and terrible. The monitor showed my heart rate climb, then slow as I breathed in and out on instruction. Dr. Mendez asked me to say what I were feeling, out loud. Grief, I said. Loneliness. A sort of searching. Name the images, she said. Tea kettle, the empty chair. Her laugh, I answered. And the act of naming pressed the memories into my chest like a small stack of metal plates. In the display, my breath regularized. Small, measurable things. That was the point. We were not conjuring anything. We were logging the state we were in. When I walked out, Marcus lifted his eyebrows. How'd it feel? He asked. Like remembering without permission, I said. He nodded. That's the point the panel finds. It doesn't value your intent. It values your presence. Presence. That word kept appearing in ways I didn't expect. It sounded less like a technique and more like an ethical stance. There is a kind of arrogance that tries to compress anything it doesn't understand into tools. If you are a technician, you want knobs and tolerances. If you are grieving, you want time. If you are someone like Jenkins, you want proof you can sell. The cohort included a little of each of that. Dr. Mendez wanted numbers. Marcus wanted maps. Jenkins wanted a business plan he could read aloud over beers. I wanted something that would make the house less loud. We were an assembly of needs. We were matched in small teams and, under supervision, invited to attempt what Dr. Mendez called focused presence. The wording was careful on purpose. We were not to attempt to cause outcomes. We were to show up as a field, to hold a state. The example she offered was modest. A group that sustained a calm, steady presence for an evening in a small district might correlate with a dip in petty altercations the next day. She read the caveats slowly. Correlation, not causation. Control conditions ambiguous. Confounds present. We were sent out to a town 3 hours from the city, a place with a name like any Rust Belt main street. We met with a local liaison, an earnest man who told us someone had noticed people seemed friendlier after a week where a church group had done extended vigils. Dr. Mendez was explicit. No advertising, no promises, no claim of miracle. Our role was small. We were to be present, to hold a state, and Dr. Mendez's team would collect data anonymously on small metrics. Local police logs for petty theft, emergency room visits for panic-related symptoms, and perhaps a few surveys from merchants who agreed to a questionnaire. It felt almost ridiculous to think this modest experiment mattered. We sat in a square, in plain clothes, in a rented community room. We said nothing to the locals about why we were there. We simply sat. The practice was not magical or theatrical. It was very, very human. Listening, offering a chair to someone at the door, asking a vendor how their day had been, and giving a full, undistracted attention to the answer. It was presence as an ethic, rather than as a technique. After a week we left. The graphs Dr. Mendez showed later were small, serrated shifts that made her both pleased and wary. Petty theft reports had dipped by a number that, on a raw percentage basis, was notable but within statistical noise. Emergency calls for acute anxiety were down a little, but the sample size was tiny. Merchant surveys showed a slightly higher score for neighborliness and a small uptick in reported sleep quality among a sample of residents. None of it was headline material. None of it was proof. It was, at best, a pattern that nudged toward hope. We did more of these expeditions, always small, always consented, always logged. The effects were inconsistent. Sometimes nothing measurable changed. Sometimes small improvements were recorded for a week or two and then faded. Dr. Mendez cataloged each run with a meticulousness that looked like care. She never used the word success lightly. For her, the program was a sequence of data points and human stories, both of which needed custodianship. When the data suggested an effect, interest grew. The problem was not that people hoped. The problem was that hope is a currency eagerly spent by entrepreneurs. Jenkins, who had been excluded from supervision after his earlier obsession, found ways to reinsert himself into network chatter. He called. He emailed. He appeared at a meeting with a slideshow and a plan that smelled of monetization, scalable presence interventions, community subscriptions, wellness packages. He spoke in numbers he hoped would make him credible. "We can systematize the state," he said. "We can train facilitators, we'll have metrics, we'll have an app." The room felt cold when he said, "app." Marcus's expression closed like a door. Dr. Mendez didn't laugh, but her face hardened into the look of someone who had seen idealism folded into business plans and returned as damage. "You can't commodify the interior without consequences," she told him. "You can't market presence like a product. Doing so invites manipulation." He argued that people wanted to buy what made them feel better. He argued that demand made the work scalable. He argued that a market could fund more research and bring more trained participants into the fold. "There is a leap from offering community support and training to instrumenting effect for outcomes," Dr. Mendez said. "And that leap is where we lose people." "I'm not trying to lose people," Jenkins said. "I'm trying to make this sustainable." "And what happens when the market demands a guarantee?" she asked. "What happens when a client insists on a measurable drop in crime next quarter and boards of directors' pressure schedules? Do you see how quickly ethical guardrails erode? He didn't see it. Or he wouldn't see it until the guardrails bent and the pressure was real. Jenkins had always been someone who saw a market and assumed systems could be built without cost. The cohort had evidence of cost. Marcus had warned me about that early. Now we watched, like technicians watching a device go toward a critical threshold. The tipping point came in a meeting where Jenkins convened a small group of his own, people he said were entrepreneurial partners. He proposed a public demonstration in a mid-sized borough, 3 nights of intensive scheduled presence aimed at lowering local disorder, with a stream of testimonials to follow. He suggested inviting the press. Marcus and Dr. Mendez both warned him in different tones. Marcus with a bluntness that sounded like a previous life in safety briefings, Dr. Mendez with clinical patience that hid a sharp edge. Jenkins listened and nodded and then organized anyway. He was persuasive. He had a partner with money. He had a plan. The demonstration went badly, not in the sense of spectacular disaster. There were no explosions, no headline violence, but in ways that were worse for people. Volunteers reported acute anxiety spikes during the sessions. 2 people who had been stable began exhibiting dissociative episodes. The borough's local clinic reported 3 people with worsening psychiatric symptoms. A family in the neighborhood who had expected to sleep better called in upset because the sessions had triggered nightmares in their teenager. And then there was the public relations fallout. A local reporter, not fully briefed by Jenkins's team, wrote a piece that used the word experiment in a tone that made neighbors uneasy. The narrative of outsiders coming to alter the community's emotions took root in a way no one had anticipated. A town meeting became a tribunal. Jenkins' partners withdrew. The money dried up. Jenkins didn't go quietly. He lashed out, blaming the community for being close-minded and the scientists for missing the marketing opportunity. He grew increasingly erratic, and as Marcus had predicted, his life frayed. The Observer, whatever it was, did not need media to be displeased. It manifested for me later that week in the dark of D2, with a clarity that made speech seem like an upstart invention. It was not like the first time, when the panel's question came like a stone thrown into a pond. This was a presence that carried weight. When it spoke, the sound nested in my head like an exact memory. It did not have limbs like human limbs. It had angles like language preferences. It presented ideas, not threats. "You are instruments," it said, not in words that matched English so much as in an intelligible arrangement that translated into those syllables. "You are potential interfaces. That is dangerous when turned into a tool." I felt the hairs on my arms stand at attention the way an engineer senses an impending surge. The Observer's presence was cool, curious, and oddly patient, like water that shapes a canyon by waiting. "We did not place the panels to grant power," it continued. "We placed them to observe. You misname our attention when you call it gift. Attention is not benevolence. It is an alignment. Your instruments reflect you because you are the variable. If you choose to manipulate, you will be like a species that brandishes its flame without knowing how fire shapes what it touches." There was no accusation in that, only a quiet clarity. It carried the line that had become a mantra between Marcus and Dr. Mendez. Power without wisdom destroys. I wanted to ask it about Sarah. I wanted to demand that it fix what was broken. I wanted to reach into the cold surface and pull out a solution like a loose wire you tighten. Instead, I felt the humility of a man whose tools had always offered discreet, mechanical answers. This was an interface whose honesty was unplayable. We brought Jenkins before a small review panel, an internal ethics committee swollen for the moment with Dr. Mendez's colleagues. He defended his actions with the fervor of an entrepreneurial zealot. He accused us of quashing progress. He suggested that fear of consequence was the true sin here, not his hubris. He left the room with his head held high enough to suggest he had won something. 2 months later, Jenkins disappeared from public view entirely. He was taken into a private clinic under a corporate contract, labeled as post-critical stress. The language masked what had happened in the same way paint hides a crack. Some people in our cohort said he had burned every bridge and pushed until something in him simply went dark. Others said that trying to sell presents turned him into a predator of people's hope, and predators rarely fare well when they are stripped of permission. His absence was both a relief and a warning. It pointed to the moral crux we had been circling. The moment you decide you can steer what the panels reflect, you invite harm. Not because the panels are malevolent, but because human desire to control is a blunt instrument. That realization shifted the program. Dr. Mendez canceled any public demonstrations. She tightened the consent processes and the supervision. She insisted on smaller cohorts and mandated debriefings. She began to frame the work less as an opportunity to fix and more as a call to live deliberately. The language changed from intervention to practice. There was less talk of towns saved and more of individuals offering consistent presence in the places they already inhabited. It was not a heroic pivot. It was administrative and moral and painfully ordinary. The change felt like a community deciding to stop advertising miracle cures and instead build community resources. It was a slow, bureaucratic reformation. But that slowness was, perhaps, its virtue. I found myself gradually less interested in the panel as a novelty and more interested in the way my life, the little room with the kettle, the path up to the mailbox, could be different if I stopped trying to fix the past and started attending to the present. The difference was subtle. It was a change of attention, not an incantation. My practice was not a technique I could put in a list. It wasn't a set of steps for a video. It was a habit of noticing. When a coworker paused at the lunch table and stared at their hands, I did not look away. When the new technician, a kid named Raoul, mixed up a part and cursed himself, I did not roll my eyes and move on. I sat with a cup of coffee and asked him what he was thinking about. Sometimes I listened. Sometimes I offered a small, practical solution. Often nothing changed in an obvious way, but the small acts accumulated. The house felt less loud because I, in my limited band, was less absent. People noticed presence, not as a spectacle, but as a simple correction. Jenkins had sought to make it spectacle. The Observer had warned us against that arrogance. Dr. Mendez had instituted boundaries. Marcus stayed skeptical, but gentler, like a man who had seen his warnings justified, but still hoped for human resilience. There were small, measurable ripples. A coworker named Ruth, who had been curt with everyone since her divorce, started bringing in a loaf of bread on Fridays for the break table. She didn't tell us why she did it, and we pretended not to ask. A guy on the third shift who had been habitually late started setting 2 alarms, and after a few months of consistent practice, began showing up on time. A neighbor named Jenkins, no relation to the problem, who had been a meter away in community meetings, started to speak up with a voice that had been small and then grew steady. None of these changes were miraculous. None of them supplied a definitive causal chain from panel to world. They were, rather, the slow accrual of small acts that sometimes rearranged the texture of daily life. Dr. Mendez continued to publish carefully worded reports that insisted on caveats. The Observer's admonition remained a touchstone in our briefings. Talking about awakenings became an embarrassed phrase some of us avoided. There were losses along the way. Some people could not adapt. The interface was merciless in its neutrality. It reflected whatever state you presented, and some people, fragile, grief-rent, could not hold the mirror without being harmed. A woman named Anna, who once heard music in her refrigerator, moved across the country and changed her name. Lewis, who had received otherwise private faces from the past as if broadcasted to him, checked into a facility for a long remediation period. They were not casualties in a war. They were private stories about what happens when the interior shifts in ways you cannot quite map. I thought often of the Observer's phrase, "Power with wisdom creates." It sounded like something you could pin under glass, but it was not a slogan. It demanded a daily practice. Wisdom required patience, community, humility, and a recognition that people's lives are not experiments. Months passed. The panels remained in D-series rooms, tucked away and watched. The cohort thinned and thickened in cycles as people came and went. Dr. Mendez Group continued to publish. Her language became ever more cautious. Marcus continued to drive me to the warehouse on occasion to debrief, and we sat like 2 men at the edge of something to which we had no final right. One night, after a long day of logs and a longer evening of quiet domestic maintenance, I went back to the house and made chamomile tea. I sat in the chair that had been Sarah's and did not pretend it was not a seam in the room. I pressed my palms on my knees and felt the calluses of a lifetime of work, and in the pause before sleep I whispered, "Why are you empty?" Not to any device, but to myself, because words sometimes act as bearings. The practice was not a cure. The house remained a house shaped by absence. But the attention made small things more possible. A neighbor's dog stopped barking as much, because someone on that block began to walk it sometimes. A woman at the grocery store who had seemed always on edge smiled at me once, as if she had been offered a reprieve from rushing. Those were not massive shifts. They were modest, human acts, a cumulative shaping of the edges. Sometimes the panels pulsed when we were near them. Sometimes they did not. Sometimes the security logs recorded anomalies. Sometimes they were quiet. Dr. Mendez published a paper that concluded, in its careful phrasing, that there were correlations deserving of further study, but that the ethics of scale were unresolved. The academic and practical communities argued, as they do. The public remained broadly uninterested or skeptical, as it should. I kept notebooks. I logged anomalies, but less obsessively. The act of writing had once been a way to prove reality. It had become, for me, a way to notice. I cataloged small patterns, the dates when a coworker laughed in the hallway, the nights when rain seemed to fall only on the roof of the warehouse and not on the loading docks, the way a certain song would make me think of Sarah in a particular angle. My ledger was quieter now. It did not need to scream to be true. There were moments of wonder that did not dissolve into explanation. Once, months after I had first touched D2, I stood in a park and watched a child hand a lost dog a sandwich it had dragged from a trash can. The child looked up and smiled at the owner with an effortlessness that made the owner laugh until tears came. I felt something in my chest that felt less like repair and more like the soft knitting of small stitches. I thought of the observer and its cool, patient voice. I thought of Marcus and the way he had said, "Don't try to fix it." I thought of Dr. Mendez and her graphs and caveats. We are not the sum of spectacular events. We are, mostly, the sum of what we sustain. The panels taught me that. Not because they reached out and pushed the world into being, but because they held a mirror and forced some of us to notice what we were showing. There remained ethical edges I could name but not heal. There remained people who fell apart under scrutiny, and others who discovered new margins of care. The program that centered around the D-series panels became less a laboratory and more a network of practices and guarded observations. Dr. Mendez made contact with other institutions to create safeguards. Marcus, always the cautious mapper, worked on documentation that emphasized restraint. Jenkins became, for me, an example of how quickly good intention can couple with personal need to create damage. His story sat like a char on the margin of every new proposal we received. I am still a technician. I still notice the sound a failing relay makes. But my hands have learned other things. They have learned to carry pans of food to a neighbor's doorway, to repair a broken hinge for someone who cannot afford a handyman, to place a cup of tea on a colleague's desk rather than giving advice from a distance. These are small acts, but small acts are durable. The cohort continues to do research in tight ethical frames. Dr. Mendez is still cautious. Marcus is still watchful. The observer does not speak often. When it does, it speaks not to instruct, but to widen the moral field. "Do not confuse access for dominion," it said once when we met in a D-series room in the quiet hours, the panels dimmed and patient. Attention is a leverage. Use it with care. I do not know whether what we did changed the arc of anything larger than a few neighborhoods and a handful of lives. I do not know whether humanity will awake to something gentler or more perilous. The panels are, for me, a lesson in humility. They asked me a question I could not answer with tools. They forced me to learn a different skill: how to be present. If you are listening to this and you feel skeptical, good. Skepticism is a healthy lens. If you are listening and you have, like me, carried a private emptiness for a long time, then you know what it is to be asked, by a strange surface, why you are hollow. The question is not an accusation, it is an invitation, if you let it be. I don't have a list of instructions or a guaranteed method to tell you. I have instead a modest invitation. For 2 weeks, only 2, notice what patterns return in your day. Notice what thoughts keep circling back, and what moments make your chest tighten or unbind. Write them down if that helps you see them. Don't attempt to force outcomes, and please do not seek out panels or devices. This is not about contact points, it's about attention. After 2 weeks, if you wish, leave a one-line comment about what you noticed. No promises, no cures, just observation. If you're curious to read more, if the ledger of our group's small trials and Dr. Mendez's careful caveats interests you, there's an optional booklet we've prepared that outlines our published findings and cautions. It's for those who want a deeper dive without turning attention into a commodity. Consider it a resource, not a remedy. When I think of the night I walked into the wrong room and felt that small pulse under my skin, I still have a hard time calling it anything definitive. I never believed in aliens, at least not in the cinematic way we imagine them. But I cannot deny that something unfamiliar touched a seam in me and asked in the plainest possible way, "Why are you empty?" The unbelievable moment wasn't a spectacle, it was a mirror. It demanded that I reckon with what I carried. It asked me to choose between trying to control outcomes and learning to live more consciously in the small circuits of my life. I chose the latter. Not because it's easier, but because trying to force a life into being breaks more than it builds. I continue to show up in small ways. I continue to keep notes. I continue to listen. I remain skeptical about claims of mass transformation. I am wary of markets that would sell presence as a product. And I remain, in the way a human can remain, open to the possibility that something bigger than our current vocabulary is at play. If you decide to do the 2-week observation, remember, this is about noticing, not fixing. If you feel overwhelmed or unsafe at any point, seek help from professionals you trust. This story is not an instruction manual. It is a report from someone who learned the hard way that attention is not neutral. I woke up the morning after a rainstorm and made chamomile tea. The kettle sang in its old reliable way. I sat in the chair that had been Sarah's, and felt the house as a room with an echo that sometimes steadied. I do not know the fate of humanity. I do not know if the panels will ever be anything like the myths people tell at bars. I do know that the question lodged in me has not gone away, and in that not going away there is a subtle change. I stopped trying to fix the past with my hands alone, and started offering what the world sometimes lacks, an honest, present attention. If this story moved you, if it sits with you like a small stone in the pocket, leave a one-line comment about your observations after 2 weeks. If curiosity nudges you further, the optional booklet is available in the description. No guarantees, no miracle cures. Just a witness who was stubborn enough to follow a pulse into a wrong room and changed, slowly, because some things ask for presence rather than proof. I never believed in aliens until a black panel pulsed and asked what I had been avoiding. I still don't have all the answers. But the question has made me different in the quietly important ways that matter. I listen more. I hold less as a thing to be fixed, and I try in small imperfect acts to be present for the people around me. That, for now, is enough.